I've been really busy lately, and I've kind of busy in meetings, busy doing work, busy just doing life, and I kind of recognize this, and I saw my 4-year-old son, Elliot, and I was like, I really need to take him out on his bike. So we went cycling together, and I realized that his bike had no brakes. I also realized that his bike had no seat. Then I also came to realize that he didn't know how to ride a bike, to my shame, and he's 4-year-olds. Now, I know some people like Ben, his children, they rode bikes at like 2 years old, 3 years old, because he's a good father. And so I was like, okay, I had this kind of moment of shame, because I could see myself at the park with all these mums looking down their nose at me, laughing at me as I was pushing my 16-year-old onto his bike and trying to teach him how to ride a bike. And I kind of, the last thing you want is your child living with you when he's like 30 years old and getting in bed with you to watch Star Wars. And like, where's the Frosties? You're like, I'm pretty sure you should have a job. Anyway, so I had a moment of holy discontentment, and I went to the bike mecca, Halfords, and bought him a brilliant red BMX. How cool is that? How cool is that? A brilliant bike like that. A BMX. How many people in the room have had a BMX? Come on, they're the cool kids. They're the roadmen in our church, the one with the cred. How many people had a racing bike? Raise your hands. Oh, these are the posh people. The posh people. You probably are wearing tweed today and shop at Waitrose and eat sushi. That's the ones with the racer bikes. How many people remember the chopper? A chopper. Oh, we've got some. Yeah, they were like the great bike from the 70s. Do they exist still today? I'm not sure. Got Johnny here. Actually, he repairs them. If you need your bike repairing, see the man in the middle. He's waving his hand. Choppers. They were for like the Hells Angels, weren't they, of the biking world? Kind of like they would hang around outside of Tesco's Direct. And they were like the posse. They were the people who had the kind of cred. They were dangerous. I also put a picture up today of the penny farthing, okay, just for Pastor Frank and Pastor Stan, who started the church. This is what they rode back. Should we give them a hand? Aren't they wonderful? They went at all length. It's a bit pixelated. There they are. They're so old, even the pictures are pixelated. Who would have thought that? Look at that. That was as good as it got. The missionary spirit right there. Anyway, we got the bike, and literally within an hour, he had learnt to ride his bike. How good is that? He had trainer wheels on, it's true. Now, here's the question. How does a 4-year-old learn to ride a bike? Well, people with PhDs study how you learn to ride a bike. First, Elliot would have to have an intimate understanding of aerodynamics. You have to understand how the motion of air interacts with an object. He'll also have to have an intimate understanding of biomechanics, okay? He'd have to understand how the elastin in his skin under his foot would press down on the pedal. He'd also have to have a very good understanding of sports psychology. How does a 3-year-old, how does a 4-year-old get on an object with 2 wheels, or maybe even with training wheels, knowing that possibly they will fall off and embarrass their dad or their mum? The question, how does a 4-year-old ride a bike in 1 hour, is really simple. It's the same reason that a professional cyclist can ride around, like in the Tour de France, 2,200 miles at 119 days, approximately around 25 miles, 24 miles an hour. You get to do it through practice. It's that simple. Elliot could not analyze how he rides a bike. But he gets to do it because he's become a good practitioner of cycling. Now, we live in this moment in history, don't we? As Dan said, we're a day, suddenly in a decade. History is happening in front of our very eyes. The world is complex with Brexit and the redefining of our kids' gender and vaccines and masks and global pandemics and wokeness and atomic threats. But in all that, a 4-year-old can still get on a bike and learn to ride a bike because practice still counts in a very complex world that we live in. And sometimes as Christians, we're waiting for this perfect moment where God moves into our lives. Or we're waiting for the atmosphere just to be right. Maybe we're waiting to become like the well-rounded human beings with all the right kind of grades and GCSEs. But the good news is, whatever the atmosphere, Jesus is calling us out to follow him. You know, the time in history, the time in our lives will never be right apart from now. And it's in this moment that Jesus is calling us to follow him. And the heart really for this series on work has been this idea that we believe that the next renewal of the gospel, the next awakening, isn't going to become through vicars and priests alone. It's going to come as the whole body of Christ take the presence of God through practice into their places of work, into the 7 key cultural streams. Now, next week, we're going to pray over every single woman and man who are working into these cultural streams, okay? Of business, media, social care, church, government, education, and the arts. So come ready for that. But the first part of practicing is knowing that God has a calling on your life. He has placed you in a time and for a time such as this. You know, God calls children, God calls teenagers who lack self-confidence. I love this one from Jeremiah. He's just 17 years old. Is anyone 17 here? Raise your hand. 17-year-olds. We've got some 17-year-olds. Well, this is what God's saying to you at 17. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as prophets to the nations. Alas, sovereign Lord, Jeremiah replied, I do not know how to speak. I'm way too young, he said. But the Lord said to me, do not say I'm too young. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and I will rescue you. God calls teenagers. God calls defunct families. Anyone got a dysfunctional family background like we have? Oh yes, you know, in so many different ways we're dysfunctional, but God calls Abraham, doesn't he, and Isaac and Jacob. It says all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my command. He calls nations, whole nations, he calls us to rise up. The Israelites had just known slavery, okay? They were the epitome of learned helplessness. And listen to what God says. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my commandment, then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you'll be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God is calling us to be practitioners of the way in this time. You know, there are 3 family of faith when it comes to calling. Okay, the Eastern, which is probably the one we're less familiar with, the secular, and the Judeo-Christian worldview. The Eastern worldview says about calling and purpose and fulfillment, forget it. The goal of life is not to engage in fulfilling your purpose, it's to escape the material world. Its freedom is not freedom to be an individual, like in the secular worldview, it's freedom from individuality. Buddha and Hinduism, okay, they believe in the cycle or wheel of reincarnation. You see, individualism and attachment to the material world causes us to have craving, which leads to attachment, which binds us to the wheel of reincarnation. So if you're a Hindu, you believe you can be recycled 18,000 times. The goal is to escape purpose and calling. You don't know how blessed you are when you're a Christian, do you? Buddha didn't say, I am liberated. He said, it is liberated. He had achieved the non-self. He once said, I am nowhere a somewhatness for anyone. Work that one out. He'd become enlightened and achieved the non-self. The second worldview is probably the one that we know more ourselves. It's the secular worldview. Okay, the secular worldview of calling says the individual, you are sovereign over all. It's not freedom from self per se, it's freedom to express yourself. So yes, we have calling and we have purpose, but you have to make it happen. It's about you. It's Nike doctrine, isn't it? It's just do it. We've got a Nike girl in the church here, haven't we, somewhere? Everyone gets their Nikes from. And I'm saying it right to say Nike, not Nike. But it's just do it, isn't it? That's the goal. Okay, so it's all about you. If you want to be a Scandinavian, woke, gender-neutral, Mexican taxidermist who lives hanging upside down like Batman with a tattoo on his shoulder that says, I'm a snowflake, just do it. Oh, that was a lot of words right there in a very short area of my page. Just do it. Bertrand Russell said, we are nothing more than a chance collocation of atoms. Richard Dawkins said, life is a stroke of dumb luck. We are the sum total of chance plus time plus matter. Therefore, just do it. Invent purpose. Or Nietzsche put it this way, the goal of life is to say, thus I willed it myself. And it sounds really cool when you're 17 years old and you're kind of young and you're healthy and you've got the world in front of you to live, and maybe you come from a prosperous background, but for so much of the world, that is absolutely stupid and impossible. Half of our world live in extreme poverty. For the teenagers now growing up in the Ukraine, they cannot say, thus I willed it. Putin, the strong man, is saying, thus I willed it. There are all kinds of problems with that argument. We have the Judeo-Christian worldview, which says that we are loved by God and we have a calling on our lives. Freedom is not found in escapism, like New Lives in the Wild. Does anyone watch New Lives in the Wild? I love that. There's that sense of getting away. But they always look like they've drunk the Kool-Aid as well, don't they? Because kind of like, I don't know about you, but I kind of need community to keep me in check. I don't have all the gifts. I'm not well-rounded at all. I need people in my life. But we have this, we're not called to escapism. Freedom for us is not found in reinvention. Freedom is found in your response and my response to God's calling on our life. And if you didn't know that, say, know that God has called you and he speaks. He's a communicative God who wants to speak daily into your life. I love that verse from Acts 13:36 that says, David served God's purpose in his generation, then he died. That's the epitaph for the Christian. That David, Bickle right there, would serve God's purpose in his generation, then fall asleep. That's the call for Sophia, that Sophia would hear the call, respond to the call, and serve God's purpose in her generation, and then be with God. Another version says David served the counsel of God. Another version says David served God's will and purpose. Another version says David served his own generation and then fell asleep. So calling, as Os Guinness says this, calling means that when Jesus calls us to follow him, everything we are, our being, everything we do, our actions, and everything we have, our possessions, are given direction and a dynamic because now they are done unto the call of God on our lives. And I think what I want us to really kind of know today, I kind of want us just to hit the pause button today because we're a very active church who are busy for all the right reasons. And I'm part of that. I'm an activist. So I was saying at the Leaders' Night on Wednesday, I love airports, I love movement. Okay, if anyone's flying anywhere tonight, raise your hand. I'll go with you. I'll go to Gatwick. We'll do something. We like the buzz, the movement. I feel better. Things are happening. Okay. But ultimately, before we're called to somewhere or to something, we are called to someone, aren't we? Unto Jesus. Before we're called to go somewhere or do something, we are called to someone. You know, in Mark 1:16-20, it says this: as Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, and they were fishermen. And he said, "Come, follow me." Jesus said, "And I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with hired hand and men and followed him. In Mark, later on in chapter 2, it says, once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. And he walked along, and he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. And he said, "Follow me." Jesus told him and Levi, and he got up and followed him. We're called to be a generation of practitioners who follow physically after this Jesus. John 10:27 says this: "My sheep, they hear my voice, I know them, and they what? They follow after me." So what is a Christian? Have you ever thought about that basic premise? There's some crazy ideas of what Christians do and what they think and what they should be doing. Okay, some people think that Christians are just the holy joes of society. I remember friends from school said, "Oh, I can't go to church because it's just for holy joes, people who've got their lives all together." And that's absolutely the absolute opposite. Christianity is for people who haven't got their lives all together, because it's actually all about following the one who has got his life together, which is Jesus. He is the life, isn't he? So what is a Christian? Well, a Christian is not a statistic. According to a recent poll, 49% of Britons consider themselves Christians. 26% say they're Christian because they are in a Christian nation, per se. 59% say they are Christian because they were christened, which is an interesting stat. In 2019, a poll showed that only 1% of the population go to state churches, 600,000, and a third of those people are over 70. Christianity is not a statistic. A Christian is not someone who gives mental assent to propositional statements about Christianity, okay? That'd be great, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be amazing if Christianity was kind of like a test, a theological test? So we would arrive one day at the pearly gates, and St. Peter would be there with a clipboard for the Catholics, ready to go. Over here on this side of the pearly gate, we'll have St. Paul with a clipboard for the protesters or the Protestants, and you'd have to go in and you'd have to answer a set of questions on faith. Wouldn't that be good? I think some of us would do really well. Do you believe? First of all, what's your name? Bob. Bob, you're down. Do you believe in the resurrection? Tick. Do you believe in the virgin birth? Yes, possibly, maybe, no. Yes, got that right too. Do you believe in flat earth theory? Oh no, forget that one, that was a trick question. Do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah? Yes, I believe. What do you think about the Nephilim? No, I'm just kidding. We won't put that one in. I think some of us would do really well at some of these questions. But the trouble is, Satan believes all those things as well. He was there at the resurrection. He knew that Jesus rose from the dead. Christianity is not giving mental nods to doctrinal statements about Jesus himself. It's about becoming a follower, isn't it, of Jesus? The name Christian actually is a derogatory term, first used by the Romans, wasn't it? They would call the early Christians little Christs or mini Christs, people that are trying to copy the Christ, and they would mock them for it. In fact, in the Bible, there are only 3 references to Christian, but actually there are 268 references to discipleship, to the word disciple. And in the Hebrew, it's the word talmidim, which means disciple, follower, student. The best word is probably apprentice or a practitioner of the way of Jesus. They were known as people of the way. So could we just do a 3-minute geek sort of down the rabbit hole of what it means to be a disciple? Hands up if you want geek trials for 3 minutes. No one. Okay, two of us. Okay. Right, in conclusion to today's sermon, I've always felt discipleship, was the apex of first century education system for young kids. So the first level of discipleship was called Beit Sefer, and it meant house of the book. And it would end around kind of age 12. And to go through that, you'd have to memorize off by heart the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Do you think you could do that, guys? I mean, if you're like me, I forget the name of my children, so I'm pretty forgetful. This is just Genesis. Imagine 5 of these. I mean, it's got some commentary on it, in it as well. Imagine that. I mean, they used to say, didn't they, that, human beings have like a memory span of like 13 seconds. And now over the last decades with social media, we have the memory of about 9 seconds. And a goldfish has got the memory of 12 seconds. So basically, we've got less capacity to remember than a goldfish. Don't you feel lifted by that in spirit? Oh, yes, I feel so. It's like I'm achieving. I'm doing so well. Okay, and if you've got ADHD, well, it's about 6 seconds, so good luck to you and me. Okay, the next step, if you were the best of the best, though, and you memorize those first 5 books of the Old Testament, you go to the next level. Only the best would achieve this. Most girls and boys at 12 would start working in the apprenticeship of their father, or girls would get married, sadly, around 12 or 13 years old. This is pre-women's rights and that kind of stuff, so, we've progressed a bit since then, But the next level was Beit Talmud, which is called House of Learning. It would be for the best of the best. Now, these guys would have to learn the entire Old Testament off by heart. Isn't that incredible? And if they went through that, the best of the best of the best who achieved that would be taken on as talmidim. They would be taken on as disciples. And they would go through a rigorous time of questioning. They would look at their shape and their heart and their abilities, their work ethic, their personality, their experiences. And if they got through this ruthless interrogation with the rabbi of the moment, they were chosen to be followers of the way of that rabbi. Now, to be with a rabbi, it meant 3 things. To be a disciple, you had to be with your rabbi 24/7. Follow them, eat, sleep next to them, walk like them. There's a famous saying that says, it's a blessing from the first century, that says, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. They had to become like the rabbi. So they had to be with your rabbi. So say after me, be with your rabbi. Be with your rabbi. The next thing you had to do was become like their rabbi. Say after me, become like my rabbi. Yeah, that's to become like my rabbi. Jesus said to his followers, you will become fishers of men. And that was a Hebrew idiom meaning you will become a teacher. A teacher was known as a fisher of men. And he said, in other words, you'll do what I will do. They had to become like their rabbi, and they had to last all do what he did. Do you remember Jesus sent them out to preach, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cast out demons? So what is a Christian? That was our big question, and we've gone the long way round to get there. Really, it's a disciple. A Christian is someone who wants to be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did. We don't hang out with first century Jesus. We don't get to be covered in the dust of our rabbi and stay just a meter behind him and follow and walk with him. The way we do it in our world is through a relationship with the Holy Spirit. Isn't that right? You know, this evening we've got an encounter night, haven't we, at 6 p.m. service, a Holy Spirit evening. It's through entering into relationship and knowing God. The primary goal of a practitioner, of an apprenticeship, is learning to live in a constant state of awareness and connection of the Spirit of Jesus. That is our first goal as followers of Jesus. Jesus, do you remember later on when he was going to go to the cross and he realized he was leaving his apprentices, his followers, his practitioners behind, he said, I will ask the Father and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever. It's interesting that another in the Greek is another of me. He will give you another of me and you will become an advocate of where I'm going. John 15, straight after that, he says, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit. While every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will bear even more fruit. Have you been pruned over the last few years? That may be a good sign. God wants you to bear even more fruit. And listen to this. He says, remain in me. He says, come on, remain in me, as also I remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from me, you can know some things in your own strength, church. Apart from me, you may have a good go at it. Apart from me, what do we get to do? Nothing. Now, we're going to talk about our secondary callings maybe next week. What we do, and it's so important. Everything's sacred to God. But the primary is remaining in God. Because without that, we can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask what, this is phenomenal. Ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit. It's all about our ability to remain connected to the presence of God, isn't it? It's all about vines. We don't really grow grapes as well as the French. They're good at producing wine, but we're great at producing apples, aren't we, in the south coast of England, and pears and things like that. How do you get a top quality, I'm not sure if this is a top quality apple. It's like anyway. How do you get a quality piece of fruit? How do you get a great apple if the apple remains connected to the branches and the branches remain connected to the Father, which is the trunk of the tree? You know, we don't have to huff and puff and clench our buttocks and say Jesus in a really Pentecostal word to get this apple to be luscious and lovely. It just has to stay connected. You know, if we stay connected to God, whatever we ask for, according to his will, will start moving. God is going to take us further than ever before, not because of what we do, but because of who we get connected to. You know, I love activity, and it's so ingrained in my character, and it's my gift set as well. But God is saying to us, and maybe to you, remain in me. Start with your primary calling. You know, we sometimes lose our first love, don't we? Don't lose your first love for Jesus. You know, my wife and I have our Mondays together, and it's intentional. And for years we had never really Sabbath together. It's interesting, isn't it, that Christians are very happy to brag about, I've been working 7 days a week, 24/7. And it's kind of, we're actually breaking one of the 10 commandments. We never brag about like, oh, I killed someone this week, it was brilliant. You know, no, we don't brag about that. Or I coveted my neighbour's Porsche this week. But we always brag about breaking the Sabbath, don't we? In the West, we're all workaholics. And I've had to look into my own family tree and root out workaholism, and I'm working at rooting it out. And on a Monday, we take our day together. Now, some days, we don't feel like hanging out together. I may have been mean. She may have been even meaner on the Saturday or on the Sunday. It's not possible with my wife. She's wonderful. But we intentionally build our relationship of love. You know, when we were young, 19 years old, we got a call of God to get involved with worship, music, and I remember seeking God with my older brother Sam, and 4 o'clock in the morning, we'd be up. He's a real hero. And out of that sense of call, we travelled all over the world. We had nothing at the beginning. We spent tens of thousands of pounds on PA systems and instruments. In fact, we bought the church here, its first PA system, like 5 lads who are like in their early 20s. Spent 30 grand, I think, back then. It's the day of the penny farthings. We wrote singles and EPs and albums, and we travelled. We did some great gigs in arenas. We did some terrible gigs to like 3 old ladies knitting through our gigs and a pet dog called Buster watching us. We did more of those than the good gigs. But once all of that ends, where do you go? Where do you really turn? Because so much of our lives is fueled on adrenaline and activity, and it starts with a call, but it doesn't always end with what God's doing in your life. And the tragedy is that so many people from that music industry that we knew, so caught up in the adrenaline of the moment and touring the activity, that they forgot that ultimately they were called in the beginning to follow and serve Jesus alone. And I was just chatting with a friend of mine who works with maybe the top 10 sound engineers in the world, in the UK. Nearly all of them have lost their friendships, their relationships, their kids. But they're all called by God into work. And they were brilliant. They were the best at it. But today, they're alone. And they haven't gone back to the source. It's so important that we don't forget and we don't lose our first love. It's so easy to drift, isn't it? Drift in our relationship with God, drift in our relationship with our loved ones. And no one has ever drifted to a good place, have they? We're called back to the source to remain solely for Jesus. I love that story of Peter's restoration. Do you remember he'd been through some turbulence? He fell off his bike. He loved Jesus. He followed him. He thought he would fight for him to the end. And Jesus said, no, you're going to deny me. And he didn't deny him just once. He denied him once, twice, thrice. And there's this moment after the resurrection when Jesus just restores him. The third time he said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him this 3 times. The third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. It doesn't say, if you work for me, then Jesus will love you, which is what many of us do. We work to get approval of love from God. If you love me, feed my sheep. God is calling us to return to our first and central love for him. Have you fallen off your bike? as turbulence calls you to run, to protect yourself, to harden your heart, God is calling you. He's communicating to you. He wants you to follow him, and he wants you to come into not mental ascent, but into a new apprenticeship under the voice of Jesus. Have you drifted from your first love? Remember, before we were called to something or somewhere, we were called to someone. We were called to the person of Jesus, to love him first. And if that stays in order in its right place, everything else in our life, even our mistakes, fall into the right place because our first love is put back into its first situation and place. Remember your calling. We serve the one. Well, we're just going to take communion. Should we just stand to our feet with our communion pods for a second? And then we're just going to sit back down and pray.